Welcome back to the YWAM Nashville podcast. This is Nolan from the media team. Youth of the Mission Nashville is a missional community that's been reaching the Nashville area for over 30 years. Our heart is to see the name of Jesus made known to the nations by training and equipping missionaries to go from Nashville to the ends of the earth. This series is designed to give you a taste of what DBS lectures are like here at YWAM Nashville. This week's episode features Jason Bamboo Elwood, a Bible teacher from YWAM Richmond and a recent graduate of the BTS. He spoke on the tribal period, Israel's beginnings in the Promised Land, and what we can learn from their journey with God. Let's dive in.
Got food, and I kept going, and I got about 5 miles in, for the night. There's some things I could tell about it, but basically, went to sleep in some rocks, because it was better than sleeping in the snow. Got up, tried to turn on my phone, and I realized it didn't turn on. And my GPX data isn't my thing. I didn't have a map, a compass, or a guide. And what I knew is that I had 70 miles of wilderness in the snow. No trail. It's covered in snow that I was going to now have to navigate through. There's a longer version of the story. I might tell it later, but for now, I ended up finding a guy for a while, and we hiked together, but then we got separated and at a water source. And basically, the large part of the next 70 miles, I was on my own, doing my best to follow footprints. Listening on those footprints went in every direction. And you just have to make choices, and you're praying that you make the right one. And so I was in a vulnerable place, and that set me on a course to push through a night and go over the last pass, and try to navigate my way to a road. This was about 2 days later, and in the middle of that night, I ran into what probably most of us fear when we think about hiking at night in the middle of the backcountry, a mountain lion. And I was coming down. I was about to traverse over this. Just kind of go through a normal traverse, something like this. Probably look very much like this. And I was about to put on my crampons, and then I looked down into the gully, and I see this pair of eyes. Now, if you're going to hike at night, you got to get used to seeing eyes. It's just part of the deal. Some are less friendly than others, and you're not always going to know for sure which is which. And at this point, I saw the eyes, go down to the ground and begin moving fast. And I realized very quickly, you're about to fight for your life. That's what's about to happen. Wow. And so I got my axe out, and still thinking was there's got to be a way to, maybe if I could hit it with something first. And I found a bunch of rocks. There's 3 rocks just sitting there. And of course, there's there's just 3. There's nothing else anywhere. Through the rocks, third rock hit the mountain lion in the head. No way. Yeah, it was. I'm not. There's more stories, but I learned it early on in college. Unfortunately, by hitting a couple people in the head with snowballs from very long distance, that I'm not the worst shot in the world. So that thought went through my head, and that's why I thought of the rocks. So the mountain lion, is pretty upset. It moves over about 25 feet, and stays there. And at this point, I decide I gotta traverse. I'm just gonna go for it, not putting on the spikes. I gotta go, but I can't run, but I can't stay here either. And so I get across the snowfield, turn back, stay in the same place. I go another maybe hour and a half, and I hit another traverse. And right as I get to that traverse, I had probably about maybe 80% of the way across, and these eyes open up right in front of me. No I'm way. Telling you,
how far?
Probably 30, 40, 35, 40 feet, maybe. Oh my God. And again, you don't have time to think. You just have to decide, and I decided I'm going to fight, and I'm going to charge, because in the wilderness, to the aggressor go the spoils. Simple formula when dealing with animals. And again, you have to read each situation differently. But this one, I realized if it circled back and it's going after me again, you have to fight. So I moved forward and I ran at it. And as soon as I got to the edge of the traverse and the beginning of the bush kind of tree line, animal takes off. And I'm just like, man, I cannot believe this is happening. What is going on? Like, what is the deal? So I ended up, to save more story, I ended up, eventually about, I don't know how many miles later, I get to this ranger station. I decided, like, I'm going to hole up here for the night. Like, the structure is as good of protection as I'm going to find. It actually started raining as soon as I got to the structure, so the timing was crazy. But it had been, it was probably 12:31 in the morning. Earlier in that night, I had actually run into a lady, and I had asked her to help me shoot a bearing. She just so happened to be an astrophysicist, so trigonometry is just something that she knows pretty well. And that was the last information I had, and I had to walk through that whole stretch on my own, just making the best decisions I could. Well, at the end of that night, I asked God, why? Probably the question we all wonder when we face difficulty and our circumstances are not easy. And his answer surprised me. He said, know my word. And I'm like, I feel like we're having two different conversations. I just, felt like my life was at risk for, and in peril for a whole, evening, well into the middle of the night. But your response to my query was, no, my word. So I didn't totally know what that meant at the time. Later that year, I ended up starting my DBS. One of the guys came back. He had just finished his. I wouldn't say we would exactly call each other friends at that point. And I think he was as surprised as I when my name popped up on the registration for DBS. And he comes to me and he's like, you signed up for DBS? It's like, yeah. And he's like, that's pretty cool. Like through that school, we became friends. And whatever was broken between us got reconciled. He's actually one of my supporters now. But all that to say, God made it clear to me that what he wanted me to know was his word. And so when the first opportunity came up to know it better, I took it. So
Wow.
there's a quick intro on just kind of how I got here. And I'll talk a little bit about teaching. So, like, why am I here? At the end of the day, I'm here because I'm a student. You're here because you're a student. And really that's it. We're all students of the Word. I felt like the Lord began putting it in my heart to start teaching, even though I really would have avoided it forever, to be honest. Just like I avoided leading schools until someone asked me to lead one. I don't know. I would prefer to be in the wilderness doing this. But God steered me away. He steered me not away from it, but just towards something else. And so, I realized some of the teachers, one of which you just listened to your first week, Dan Lewis. He's taught in every school that I've been a part of. He just taught in the school I was at in Brazil. Yeah, for a couple of weeks. Yeah, he's taught all 3 BTSs. So I'm actually one of the first graduates from the Bible Teachers Program. That we just did 3 schools 3 years in a row, one in Tijuana, Mexico, one in Cartagena in Colombia, and then one in Curitiba in Brazil. And he taught the content for all 3 of those seminars. But all that to say, Dan Lewis has got to be, he's in the middle of his 70s.
Really?
Yeah, he is.
He's
in his 70s. He's been teaching a long time. I think he's going to continue to teach a long time. But he's not going to teach forever. And so I felt like the Lord really put a burden in my heart. You need to pick up the torch. Someone needs to start picking up the torch. And so, I got interested in teaching, and that's actually how I got into BTS, Bible Teacher School. And my base was really supportive of it. So ultimately, I guess what I can tell you is that the Bible has transformed my life. And I really believe that it can transform yours. But it's hard to do that when we don't know it, and we don't know it until we've read it. And in some ways, that's what DBS is really about. It's helping us to read it fully, maybe for the first time, and so that we can know it and allow it to transform us. Yes?
Can you elaborate on that? Like, how does it transform your life?
Yeah, well, first it transformed my relationship with the Word. So actually, I believe it or not, I have a degree from a long time ago, but in the Bible, I got through with that degree, studied biblical studies, youth ministry, leadership. But when I got to the end, I realized, like I know the Bible, I don't know if I know the Bible. And so maybe the difference I'm illustrating is the difference between like knowledge and meditation. And if you're just looking for knowledge, that's great. But ultimately, if you don't dwell upon the word, it's not going to really transform you. It's not going to be written on your heart. It's just going to be something you can utilize, but not transformative. So I think for me, it challenged the way that I walked with God. Like I was always faithful to serve. I think that's always been, really probably my strong suit. But it challenged my ability to just rest, in the Lord. Like as you just read Joshua, God is inviting everybody into his rest. He gives them the land, and with the hope of using them to become a nation of priests, to become that witness, to become that invitation to the world. But we're going to talk about Israel and their history in a little bit, and whether they really obeyed that, succeeded, or didn't. But for my life, it really caused me to, I guess, quiet down in a way my mind and open my spirit to just allowing that voice to lead me and guide me. It also showed me how much God really loves me. So, like, you are studying God's redemptive plan. That should be a big focus. The story that you're pulling out, this great meta narrative that God has been writing for thousands of years, like you have been one of his aims, your heart. So was I. I think because of the way I grew up, I was probably felt like maybe I'd be more valued for what I could do, whereas God is not valuing me for what I can do. Like his value, like I have value because he's my father. I have value because I'm his son, because that's where my identity lies. It's not in my abilities. He gives us all gifts, but they're gifts. They're free. Like if you develop them, that's great. But ultimately, you're a son first. You're a daughter first. And you see the little kids running around the base here, and it's like their parents adore them just because they're them, not because of what they can do for them. In fact, half the time they probably do all sorts of things.
Right.
So I don't know if does that help a little bit? Like, yeah, I believe that the word can change your life. It really can. Before.
Are you guys gonna have to be? Are you guys planning to have BTS here in America or?
That's a question for Yo. There might be a BTS Plus next year, which is has to do with I think the history between the Old and the New Testament. But that'd be a Yo question. I'm not actually in charge of BTS. All right, so we are going to jump into the Book of Joshua. Book of Joshua. So you guys read Joshua, right? Okay. All right. I always double check because I think every now and then sometimes people are behind in a reading schedule and you're like, oh, you guys read? No. Make sure that we're on the same page. How can the Book of Joshua help us succeed in our call to spread the gospel to the nations? This is a question I'm throwing out there rhetorically for now, but it's a question we're going to be answering, as we go through the next couple of days. It's also a question you'll continue to ponder as you go throughout the week. Why you do your homework, but ultimately in your life, this is a question that for you to succeed in the call in your life, Joshua is a great book to pay attention to. Arguably, I'd say it's probably this is the most successful generation, maybe, in all the generations that you're going to see, in the Word. And I mean that. That generation was unlike any other generation. And the generation that follows it, as you probably already know, but if you don't already, you're going to by the end of today when we read it, is really going to walk in very much the opposite spirit. So what were the keys to their success? Aside from like the battle of Ai, they were entirely victorious in their battles, as far as we know. Joshua generation clung to their covenant with God. It's an important word for you to remember in light of the next couple of books. That's the word covenant. That's what's being established. It's established, with Abraham. It's established with Moses. It's established again in Deuteronomy, where they recovenant. What were the practices? What were their practices that led to their success? And in many ways in America, I think I won't point fingers. I would say in recent years, I would say we were more closer to a Judges generation than a Joshua one. And I'm speaking as a whole when I look at the country and I think about the kinds of practices and evil and different things that we're seeing. I never thought I'd see it. And I'm a little older than you might think. I'm 43. When I graduated high school, so many of the things that are commonplace now that people just like assume or take for granted or insist on imposing upon you, it wasn't even in my imagination. A lot of that, some of that's political movements, some of it's social movements, but also some of it's just downright evil practices that are being defended and forced upon people in this country. And a lot of those practices we're going to read about, particularly in Judges. So I think in many ways we've been a little bit closer to a Judges generation than a Joshua one in recent years. That being said, how can we look optimistically at our potential for success as we read through Joshua? So we're going to try to identify some biblical action principles. How's everybody doing with BAPS?
I think the first week was a struggle.
Yeah.
Did not understand, I don't think.
Yeah.
But I think the second week did better. Yeah, we did better.
Good.
I agree. Only her homework.
Okay. There you go. Yeah. Well, it takes some time. It really does. Even once you've gone through a school, remember the first time I staffed and people started walking up to me, "Hey, is this a BAP?" And I'm like, "Yes." No, it's difficult. It's when you're writing your own. It's like you can kind of deal with your own successes and failures. But when you decide whether someone else has really kind of got it or doesn't, it changes it. It forces you to become better at identifying them and rewriting them. So we'll be looking at those. Partly because that's part of the DBS process is learning to identify them and reword them, but also because we want to apply them to our lives. That's why we do the inductive method, because it leads us to those biblical action principles so that we can lead ourselves and others to application. And again, the word that's not applied is wasted. Like knowledge puffs up the head, but it's the transformation that takes place in our heart that makes us inspired and that invitation that others are attracted to. So Joshua was a faithful leader. And his generation was an obedient one. They were radical in holiness. They were courageous, and they were trusting. They were looking for God's guidance. They were also trusting in His strategy and plan. So there's a prediction of rebellion that we're going to run into, and you guys already have in Deuteronomy 31, 14 through 23. I'm not going to reread it, but you might write it down and look back on it later. So it's Deuteronomy 31, 14 through 23. Basically, at the commissioning of Joshua, Yahweh predicted that after Moses' death, the Israelites would violate their solemn covenant. Kind of a strange prediction when you're about to send people out to go, conquer many nations, to tell them, hey, by the way, you're also going to fail. And yet, this is exactly the word that they received. In view of this coming failure, Moses was to kind of write a song as a witness to the nation's posterity, which means future generations. And it was to serve as a perpetual warning against covenant unfaithfulness. So how does Moses' prediction about Israel's future covenant failure speak about the general human capacity for failure? What do you think? So how does Moses' prediction about Israel's future covenant failure, so he predicts it, that they're going to fail, how does that speak about the general human capacity for failure? Oh, I see those hands, Vitor.
Just stretching.
Doesn't it touch on just like we're bound to like forget like what the Lord has done and or look past because we get so caught up in the moment we're living in. So it speaks about like our capacity to fail because we don't like remember to look forward, but also look back at what the Lord has done.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, absolutely. Like what we see, especially in the Old Testament, Israel forgets again and again and again and again. You're going to get into the kings and you're like, this king, he did this and everything went wrong. And then this one did one well and this one did everything wrong. And how come they don't learn? But that same, yeah, go
The
ahead.
state of their heart, right? And when their heart condition.
Yeah. Yeah, and their heart condition. Yeah, you're right. Your heart condition is directly tied to their relationship with Yahweh. And something, if we go back a little further, when they come out of Egypt, these guys don't know Yahweh. You just walk through the Pentateuch, you just walk through Leviticus, given, all these laws, why?
Sure.
Partly for sanctification, but partly because he wants them to know him. He wants them to understand he is unlike any other deity that they've run into, and they were exposed to a lot of them. It's helping them sort out what's true, from what's actually fiction. So how might this prediction of failure have affected Joshua as a new leader? How do you feel as a new leader and you get this prediction? You've just followed Moses, the greatest leader in Israel's history. Joshua is going to fill in his footsteps. How might this prediction of failure have affected Joshua as a new leader?
Maybe he's like determined to like prove them wrong.
Yeah, he might. And it depends on the person. Now Joshua is a seasoned guy. He's been around Moses a long time. He's been his assistant for a long time, and he's demonstrated great faith, to the Lord through this season. But I'm telling you, like the minute you become the leader, all of a sudden, you realize there's more to it. Like when I led my first school, I remember going into such anxiety, not because I didn't think I was a good leader, or they didn't think I could do it, but because all of a sudden I was responsible for looking ahead spiritually, walking into the room every day knowing like, I need to be in tune with what the Spirit is doing, in the Word, in the students, in the staff. And so Moses now, even though he's seen all of these people rebel and get disciplined and do terrible things and demonstrate unfaithfulness, now he's the one that's called to lead. So I think there's a lot going on in him. And so hearing this prediction of failure, I think would have had somewhat of an effect. But it also, kind of like you said, it might have driven him potentially to the one place where he really needed to go, which was to Yahweh. He needed to remember that Yahweh was leading the campaign, not Joshua. So I want to do a little bit of review with you guys. And we'll do this maybe in a different form, throughout the course of the week. Let's think of big events. What got us to where we are? Joshua is about to enter into the promised land with the second generation after the first generation failed. Let's go all the way back to the beginning. What are the big events? Think about your timeline. And you can open up your timeline. I know judgment here. But I want to get us used to kind of talking about how do I explain in less than a minute, more or less what just took place leading up to this point. So let's just start by naming out the big events. You got it. Creation? Nice. Yeah. Okay, so the flood. What happened before the flood that was really significant? Genesis 3:15.
Oh, yeah.
Oh.
They are.
That was our memory verse.
The memory verse.
It was.
And I will
The
cause
woman
hostility
between you and the woman,
Yep.
and between your offspring and her offspring.
You got
will
it.
strike your head and you will strike his heel.
Pretty significant event. Yeah, nicely done. I think in Brazil they do this. I'm not as great at it,
No,
but
don't get him started.
I know. All right, so we got creation, we got the fall, we got the flood. What happened after the flood? What was the big event?
Tower of Babel.
Tower of Babel. So what happened there?
The spiritual scattering and different languages.
Yep. So they were disobedient. They chose to exalt themselves, and ultimately God was like, "Nope, you're separated." And if you remember back, actually, in the Noahic covenant, I don't know if you guys really covered or gave much time to that, but God tells them to disperse themselves over the face of the earth, be fruitful, multiply, and disperse themselves over the face of the earth. So what did they do? They gathered at the and built this tower, this religious pagan center of worship, and God said no way. So anyhow, there's more we could talk about that. Okay, so then that comes to the family of who? Who's the family we're going to start to follow? We went from like big world events to Abraham, right? So Abraham may also had a covenant with God. Right, Abrahamic covenant. Can anybody summarize the covenant? Remember what it was about?
He gives him like laws and decrees or something, and then he'll make his descendants as numerous and give them all the land and special possessions.
Yeah, so those are really important. The things you just mentioned. So he promises them land that he's giving them. So he's also going to promise offspring. That ultimately, even though in the time probably he only understood it to mean his family or the birthing of the nation of Israel, but as we learn later, the nation of Israel is far bigger than just those that descended from Abraham. It's going to include everybody in the world who gets adopted into the kingdom of God. Then finally, he also blessing. Blessing is the other thing. If you go all the way back to Genesis, from the beginning, this is what God wants to give us. He wants to give us blessing. We have a hard time receiving blessing for some reason. We keep, dismissing it or ignoring it or throwing it away. But as we go through Abraham's family, Abraham, who was his son? Isaac, at least the one we're going to talk about. Yep, there's another one. Ishmael. And then who was Isaac's son?
Jacob.
Right, Jacob and Esau. So Jacob's a really important figure, right? How many sons does he have? All right. Yep, so he's got 12. Yep, you're right. And one of those that's prominent is going to become, his name is Joseph. Now, all of these sons actually have very important parts in Israel's history, but at least in the immediate history, Joseph is the most significant. Joseph, how did he use Joseph's life to protect Israel?
He got sold into slavery and then got taken and put in command and then put into prison.
Yep.
And then from prison interpreted Pharaoh's dreams maybe didn't he get second in command?
He does.
He
does eventually. He interprets the dreams before, but you
and
got
then
it.
becomes in command and then is able to save Israel from the great famine.
Yep. So the beginnings of the nation of Israel is protected by a son who was first they wanted to actually murder him, then they betrayed him, then they sold him into slavery. He followed Yahweh faithfully through all of this, and God helped him to rise to prominence to be the second in command over Egypt during a 7-year famine, which probably destroyed many of the people in the land. But because he followed Yahweh, God preserved the beginnings of the nation of Israel. So then that nation, of Israelites grows and grows and grows and grows. And what happens to them?
They get enslaved in Egypt.
Mm-hmm. And Pharaoh doesn't want to let them go, and so eventually, which character is sent, which figure is sent to deliver them? Moses, who also didn't exactly feel worthy, but, none of us really do, and I guess that's probably good. That way we actually depend on Yahweh instead of ourselves. We remain impressed with, God's sovereignty and direction rather than our giftings. So then Moses leads them, after, God demonstrates his power over Pharaoh, Moses leads the Israelites into the desert where they're given what?
The Ten Commandments.
Yeah, the Ten Commandments and ultimately the law, and so then they are promised a new land, right? Or at least they're following on the promise of that land that goes all the way back to Abraham. And how many years do they spend wandering in the wilderness? Because of 40, because of their disobedience. Yep. And so the first generation is going to fail ultimately. And God is going to say, none of you, except for you two. Which two are going to make it? Joshua and Caleb, right? So now we've walked ourselves all the way up, in a little bit shorter time. Throughout the week, we're going to revisit these. And so I'm going to, maybe tomorrow we'll do it as a group, but I might start calling on individuals on Wednesday. So we studied. You want to be practiced at being able to just kind of recall and do it in a kind of an elevator version fashion. You're like, you know what? Hey, there was creation, then the fall, the flood, the tower, family of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, leads them to Egypt, where Moses is going to be their deliverer, and they're going to end up receiving the law, but ultimately wandering the first generation for 40 years until the second generation grows up and they recovenant, with the Lord and enter the promised land. So I did that in probably about 30 seconds. And the more comfortable you get with the story, the more that you're going to start trying to grab on to other parts of the story and add it in so that you can tell that redemptive story easily. And at the end of the semester, you're going to be doing this anyway. So I just want to help you guys practice a little.
Yeah.
That's really helpful, because this last week, when I summarized just the first 6 books, it took me 27 minutes.
There you go.
So
cool.
This is helpful to do it quickly.
Good. No, I like it. Yeah. And start off with just the bullets. It's like, okay, fill in the other stuff as you go, as you have the ability. Get the structure first, fill it in. I'll give you a quick way to remember the first 5 books. So in Genesis, we are elected. Yeah, God picks the family of Abraham. He's like, all right, you're my guy. Exodus, we are delivered by God via the hands of Moses and through the demonstration of true power and authority by Yahweh over Pharaoh. And Leviticus, we are sanctified. Before I was talking about Leviticus 16 this morning, Day of Atonements. Numbers, we are disciplined because we grumble and complain and are rebellious. And finally, in Deuteronomy, we are going to recovenant as the second generation decides to enter the promised land and follow Yahweh into Yahweh war.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Kind of like a walk of following Jesus.
Yeah.
Pretty much. Summed up.
No, it is. And again, this is just like where you're at now with knowing Jesus and knowing it's about relationship is something they were just beginning to understand throughout the course of history. So some other themes that we will be touching upon, like holiness, fear, rebellion, complaining, covenants. These should all be familiar themes because you just walked through the Pentateuch. Those were some of the prominent ones. But also blessing. We're going to keep following blessing. Realize Jacob, what was his cardinal sin? He deceived several times. What was he looking for? Blessing. That's what he was after. Even though God already blessed him, he's like, I want more. He wrestles with God. It's like, you see this theme a lot.
Wow.
All right. I'm going to... Okay, yeah. So Book of Joshua, I'm gonna do them all because I always forget to click. I'm sorry.
Oh,
I'm very skilled with the
Why
clicking.
is it in Spanish?
What's that?
Why is it in Spanish?
So some of it's I don't really like changing my slides. Some of it's in Spanish,
Great.
some of it's in English. Just read the English slides unless you know Spanish and read both.
Yeah.
Um,
You speak Spanish?
What's that? A little bit. Yeah. But I was taught in Panama last year. And I'll teach in Panama again this year. So I keep both.
Spanish.
I keep both. Well, no, I'll teach in English with translation, but I keep both on the slides. My Spanish is okay. I can do it pretty well when I'm in conversation, but not in teaching. I don't think I trust myself that much. So yeah, this is going to take these books. All of them are going to take place, except for Psalms, are going to take place over a period of about 500 years. Psalms obviously expands a little bit longer than that. And yeah, they're written in historical narrative, which is pretty much what you've been following, the exception of Job. And they're going to detail really significant periods and histories that are going to reveal victories and failures of the Israelites. Yeah, we're also going to learn more about God's character as he continues to be faithful to his people, even when they are not. Yeah. So, yeah, I'm hoping that you'll take away a better appreciation for the meaning and kind of the relevance of each book as it pertains to God's story, but also your own walk with Jesus. All right, we're going to jump forward here. I'm just going to throw these up here because, as I said, I'm notoriously bad at remembering to click. So, author, we're going to say, is Joshua for lack of. He's the most likely person. Doesn't mean there aren't maybe a couple things that got added in, post Joshua, but dating is around 1400 BC. There is a dating debate on the book. I may talk more about it tomorrow, but in short, generally the way that we're able to kind of decide on the timeline is of one verse in 1 Kings 6:1 that says there was 480 years before the Exodus. And the beginning work on the first temple, which is during Solomon's reign. Now, again, because sometimes there's numbers that are used in the word that might be more schematic than literal. I'm not going to spend much time on that, but just so you know, there is some debate on that. I don't think it changes the truth of the word, but it might change a little bit of our understanding for exactly when things took place. Obviously, Solomon's reign can be fixed between 970 and 930 BC as he begins building in his fourth regnal year, and that's found in 2 Chronicles 3:2. But needless to say, that 400 years earlier would have put Exodus about 1446. So Joshua's invasion would have been 40 years after that in 1406 BC, which you guys have all that information in your timeline already. So the later date, which is where probably most scholars lean now, has a lot to do with archaeological evidence that would really strongly suggest that it happened a little bit later. Again, it doesn't change the nature of what happened, it just changes when. So something to remember too about both the Bible and archaeology, they're both interpretive works. When you read the word, you have to interpret what it means and what the significance is, just like when you look at archaeology. But remember, archaeology is not something that archaeology is never going to prove the Bible, but it's never going to disprove it either. Another way of saying that is that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. I'd write that one down. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So just because we don't have proof, we didn't find it, doesn't mean it didn't happen. And it doesn't mean we should be making our decisions based on that. I think about 98% of excavations have not even begun. So the reality is we're looking at a very small amount of evidence so far. But there's been periods of time where people have tried to lean on archaeology too heavily. They give it too much authority, and they get they end up making it more difficult for themselves to bear witness to the word because they've now given it a standard to measure up to that we really can't use very well. It can teach us something, but it can't teach us a lot until more of it comes out. And if only 2%, like if I gave you the Bible, gave you 2% of it, and I said, go ahead and read it, how well can you really tell me the story of the Bible? It's like you're going to have a very limited understanding. So I wouldn't get too heavy into that. But basically, the later date would have the Exodus ending, kind of closer to the beginning of the 13th century, BCE, and then the invasion would have been somewhere in the middle there, so like the 1200s. So anyhow, just to give you a little bit of background on that, because There is a big debate about it, and I'll try to touch on it more, but I don't want you to get surprised when someone brings it up and you're like, I didn't realize there was a 200-year span in the debate between when these things might have happened. So just be aware. Why was the book written? It's kind of simple. Basically, the book of Joshua kind of documents the campaigns that conquer the Promised Land, which was probably the more exciting part that you read about. And the rest is a record of the division of the land, which I'm sure was riveting among the tribes of Israel. So through the leadership of Joshua, Israel learns an important lesson that victory is going to come through obedience and faith in Yahweh, not from their own works or their own strength. So victory comes through the obedience and faith in God, and not from our own works or might. So we might rightly say that Joshua is a great leader, but it's important to remember that it is the Lord, it's Yahweh who brings victory. Joshua is a story of a transition of about a people and a culture that had been wandering in the desert to become a settled nation. And it's going to record the change of leadership from Moses to Joshua. We read that Yahweh is going to guide the nation of Israel through these transitions. And it book has 24 chapters. It's divided into 3 sections. Chapters 1 through 12 are going to detail. When I say the taking of the land, these are controlled military strikes, but it doesn't mean the same thing as occupation. They're going to go in and fight a bunch of battles, but the work's not complete. Chapters 13 through 21 are going to outline the distribution of the land, and then 22 through 24 are going to record the settlement of the land. All right. So, I think I've shared about that. What does the name Israel mean that was given to Jacob? Yeah. We wrestle or struggle with God. Yeah, great. So you're going to find this as a common theme. Israel struggles in their relationship with God the whole time. Many believers, even today, still have periods of time where we struggle with our faith. That's one of the reasons I think this school is so important. It will show you through every book of the Bible God's character. He's trustworthy, and that he wants to have a relationship with us. Through your study of the Word, my prayer is that you'll be able to see his love that he showed to Israel, but also his love for you, and ultimately for the whole world. Yeah, we shouldn't lean onto our own understanding, but by the wisdom given by God through his Word. So this specific period of history we're going to look at under Joshua is different than any other generation before it or since, even up to this day. Joshua generation was unique, and we have important lessons to take away from this book. But there's a lot of different themes that we're going to find along the way, and so we just kind of have to keep our eyes out for what some of those are going to be. All right, like I said, I'm going to click down some of the themes. Joshua is a type of Christ. Numbers 16. Numbers 3:16. Joshua's name was originally Hoshea, and which means he saves. But Moses changed his name to Joshua, meaning Yahweh is salvation. Kind of important, The English or the Spanish name we use today for Jesus was actually Yeshua in Hebrew, which is also the name of Joshua. So that's kind of cool. Moses represented the law in the Old Testament, and here we can see Joshua representing the Sabbath rest of Jesus. So Moses and the law are going to bring the people up to the border of the Promised Land, but Joshua, and likewise only Jesus, can bring us in. The law of Moses could not give up eternal life. Really only faith in Jesus can. So in Hebrews, one of the themes that you probably noticed is that Christ is better. He's the better everything, every office, every position. Jesus always is greater and is a fulfillment. Whether it's prophet, priest, king, he's greater. He's better. So God is going to fulfill his promise to Abraham, Genesis 17, 8. We're going to run into the Abrahamic covenant in Genesis 12, Genesis 15. You're going to see it repeated again, 17. Joshua was 85 years old when he became the leader after Moses. I always kind of thought of him as a younger man, but he was around for a long time. And when he started, he was Moses' assistant, which is a pretty lofty position to have. God tells Abraham, I'm going to give you and your descendants, again, this is 17:8, I'll give you and your descendants after you the land in which you are a stranger, all the land of Canaan, as an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. Like these promises, we have to follow them. Like the better you know the Pentateuch, the more the whole Bible is going to make sense. Because it always harkens back to all of these promises, all of these covenants, all of these laws. And there's some pretty significant failures too that are going to lead to the way that Israel responds in the future. Joshua also represents kind of the military leadership, but also the governing leadership, of Israel. God's going to give wisdom and unique strategies to Joshua in conquering the land. As you remember, some of them are quite unconventional. God's going to use this system of casting lots in the distribution of land, so that everybody knows that he is the one that's giving the land to each tribe. It's not just by the size of the tribe or by force or by position. So Joshua at the end of his life is going to remind people and the tribal elders to follow all that Moses had written in the book of instruction, the law. He's going to urge them to do this. All right.
When you cast lots, is that, I guess what I picture in my head is just like rolling dice. And then whatever it lands on, like, okay, get 6, you get 4.
It's a good question. I've sort of, I think fundamentally that's more or less, and I don't know if it's like, hey, this section of land, this tribe, like, I don't remember exactly. So I'll try to look it up. Could someone volunteer, maybe one of the staff, if I run into any question that I don't totally know, just write it down, and then I'll be happy to get into it tonight and give you answers tomorrow. Okay, so how are we doing?
Great.
Okay, what you guys is running is 11:15. All right, everybody thinks they can make it to 11:15? Yeah. All right, cool. So who was Joshua? He's pretty important. He was born a slave in Egypt. He's a military leader. So he's going to appear in Exodus 17:9. He's going to lead a battle against the Amalekites. This is where Moses' arms were held up. You guys remember this one? Moses' arms are held up, and they're winning. But when his arms go down, they're losing. So after the victory, God mentions Joshua by name. And Joshua defeated Amalek. This is Exodus 17:13-14. Joshua defeated Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword. Then the Lord said to Moses, write this for a memorial in the book and recount it in the hearing of Joshua, that I will utterly blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. Why do you think God wanted to be sure that Joshua heard this? Now imagine this. You're about to become the leader of Israel. How would God want you to hear this?
For encouragement?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you're not alone. You're not actually the one leading. You got the title, but God, Yahweh is the one that's going to lead and give victory. As long as Moses' hands were in the air, it's like they were winning. I'm like, what does his hands have to do with anything? It has everything to do with obeying Yahweh and Yahweh fulfilling his promise. So he's a close assistant to Moses. Joshua is allowed to accompany Moses as he went up to Mount Sinai. Moses is going up to meet with God. And he waited 40 days for Moses to come back with him. Sounds like a cool camping trip to me. I don't know. 40 days, that's a long time. Exodus 33:11 mentions the time when Moses was meeting with God in the tabernacle, face to face. After Moses left to go back to camp, it says Joshua stayed behind. I sense that Joshua pursued God. Whether anybody saw him or not, that's what he did. What is this? It's a cell phone. Cell phones help us or hurt us? How do they hurt us? Radiation, that's true. Yeah, we got to get what is it, a Faraday thing? We need to get those to keep it from zapping us now. What else? Distraction? Yeah, what else? Temptation? You have access to anything. Anything you could imagine, you can access through this thing. I mean, I don't even know if the people that we're talking about now would have any idea of that access, that potential. Potential is great. This is a great tool. I can look up anything I want to know about virtually any part of history that is known. I can have it in seconds. But this thing also has a way of disrupting things. Social media gives us connection and access to anybody in the world. But it also can isolate us from the most important relationships in our lives. And do we know the difference? Do we know what it means to sit with somebody for hours having this kind of a conversation versus this one? Which one do you remember better? Which one were you designed for? Which one is probably too much? And which one is maybe not being enough? So I guess I want to point this out to remember that when we pursue the Lord, we need to remove the things that pull us away. But I always read my Bible on my phone. There's one sitting right there that has a lot less distractions in it. Do you want your path to be harder or easier? Do you want your relationship to God to be fuller or more superficial? Are you available for that? So Joshua was also the one that trusted God. He was one of the 12 spies that was originally sent to the land of Canaan. Who gave the good report? Yes. And God is going to give them victory. He believed in it. But the other 10's fear and disobedience cost Israel 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. That should teach us something. All right. So Moses and Joshua, let's see. Are you on both? Okay. So why do you think Joshua was chosen as the next leader over Israel to replace Moses?
Because he was the son of Nun.
Okay. What else?
His faith.
Yeah, he does have great faith.
He trusted God, but nobody else would.
Yeah, he absolutely trusted God. Ultimately, God chose him. It wasn't just because of his talent or his skill, he was a faithful, you're right. He absolutely, I think God saw his character and this is someone I can use. God chose him. He picked him. I don't know why he picked me to be a teacher. It's like, I never felt like I was especially, I don't know, cool. Like, I remember growing up being like, man, I could never stand up on stage and speak and talk like. But Moses didn't think he was either, and God still used him. He surrounded him. But ultimately, we have to remember that he chose him. Numbers 27, verses 15 through 20. I'll just read them. And Moses spoke to the Lord, saying, May the Lord, the God of the spirits of all flesh, appoint a man over the congregation, who will go out and come in before them, who will lead them out and bring them in, so that the congregation of the Lord will not be like sheep, which have no shepherd. The Lord said to Moses, Take Joshua son of Nun, a man in whom is the Spirit. There is a key factor right there. The Spirit of the Lord is in him. How does the Spirit come upon someone? I think they have to receive it. They have to receive the Spirit. And just like any relationship, reject it if you want to. I wouldn't suggest it. So a man in whom is the Spirit, and lay your hand on him, and have him stand before Eleazar the priest before all the congregation, and commission him in their sight. You shall put some of your authority on him, in order that all the congregation of the sons of Israel may obey him. So he's giving him authority, but also favor. He also was proven responsible and trustworthy, like you were pointing out. Luke 16:10. We all know this verse. Like, whoever is faithful with very little will also be faithful with much. And whoever is dishonest with very little will be dishonest with much. So these little things you see them in children. Like they do that experiment where they're like, here's a cookie, and they give it to the kid, and they're like, it's going to be sitting here. We'll be back in 5 minutes. Don't eat the cookie. If you wait 5 minutes, we'll give you 2. I mean, I'm not blaming your kids. I'm just giving an example of like, sometimes the Lord tests us. Will you say no to yourself for the next 5 minutes, trusting that I have something greater for you? So Joshua proves himself on the battlefield as Moses' assistant, and that he could be trusted and that God could use him. He was a man of good character. Your character is really important. I've hired people and evaluated people for positions for many, many years now. Character is the number one thing I look for. Even if you have all the talent and the gifts in the world, I will still look to your character first.
Because you're saying before that, like, God chose him, like, it wasn't have anything to do with his character, or?
No, I'm saying it does have to do with his character.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I think that's the most important reason that, I think he chose, them because of his character.
He chose him, though, because he proved himself?
So did you write down the site numbers 27, 15 through 20? So in that verse, again, he says, take Joshua the son of Nun, a man in whom is the Spirit. So if we're obeying the Spirit in our lives, we're operating in good character. We're operating in courage. We're trusting the Lord for the victory. Like the difference. So Moses, what was Moses' great failure? You guys remember what he did?
Not obeying God's command as God said.
What was the command?
God said to speak with the rock, but he
struck it
twice.
But he told him to hit it with the stick before that, and it worked.
What?
Why didn't it work this time?
Because that's not what God said.
Yeah. So it wasn't what God said, and so he disobeys. Why did he disobey?
He's angry. He's probably.
Yeah. You guys all. I'm like, yeah, all of those things. Like he's got a bunch of people that are being rebellious. Like certainly hundreds of like thousands, maybe millions. I know we're debating the numbers, but basically, like he is. He's shown that God had me do it this way, and I want to have authority in front of these people. And so he tries to wield that authority again. But God wanted him to do it differently this time. Did it work? Well, I think that the water eventually comes out of the rock, but he lost his chance to go in the promised land. That's a tough pill to swallow. It's very difficult for me to read everything that Moses went through and did, and to know that he came up short because of this. Was it just because of this? Probably not. Yeah. So it's like there's so, and again, where you're at with the Lord changes over time. Just because you're in a good place last week with the Lord doesn't mean that you're necessarily guaranteed that this week. Like in a relationship, like if you were in a relationship with somebody, like just because, hey, things were great last week, it doesn't mean that something didn't start to come in between you this week. So it's a continual process. Joshua was chosen because God chose to use him as an instrument, but he saw that he had good character. And Joshua had proven himself faithful again and again and again. So yeah, there's probably more. Does that make sense? Okay. Sorry, these are you had a hand up.
Just a comment. Before Joshua was chosen, he was the one that helped Moses to build the altar at the mountain. The
Sinai?
Yes, he was the one that helped him. So I think that was before. So it shows like the process, like you can even relate, to the transfer of anointing,
Sure.
like with Elijah and Elisha.
Sure. And also look at his specific skill sets. He was successful in battle, so he's a military leader. He was close to Moses. He was his assistant. So he watched probably the greatest leader that you're going to see in Israel's history in Moses. And he watched him succeed. He watched him fail. He watched him struggle. Like, his pedigree is pretty amazing. But he also, even through all of that, Joshua and Caleb are the ones that had the faith. They believed that Yahweh was the one leading the battle, and it wasn't determined just by their strength of arms, or their might, but ultimately the Lord was the one giving them the victory. The hands raised was a great moment, a great teachable moment for him to see this. So we'll talk more about character. You'll get into character in 1 Samuel as you get to know Saul. But character is really important. It defines you. So I don't want us to miss that. Your reputation, that's what other people think about you. But your character, that is who you really are. And God cares about your character more than he cares about what you do. Sure. Yeah. All right. So Canaan. Why is the land they're about to enter called Canaan?
Because the Canaanites live in that.
Well, the Canaanites live there, but where did their name come from?
Because the Cain and Abel, like.
No. Go back to Noah. Go back to Noah. He had 3 sons.
Oh, Shem, Ham, and Japheth.
So who was Ham's son?
Oh,
Canaan.
yes.
Canaan.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. So what happened in that story? Something strange, something sexual. We're not really sure we understand it exactly. What was the result of that story?
They said like,
the curse.
Cursed be Canaan. And so, after the flood, they had sons and wives and, reproduction. So he gets cursed. Somehow, Noah was disrespected by Ham. Canaan receives a curse. Why Canaan? Why did he receive the curse?
Yeah, that was so weird. I don't understand.
Yeah, maybe spite. Ultimately, it's directed by God. I mean, spite's kind of a joke. But ultimately, God curses the people who are going to live in the land of Canaan. And what did those people grow into? What were the things they did that were defiled?
things defilement of the land and like
What category?
Worshipping other gods and
What are some of the specific struggles, things that they did that we would find abominable?
giving the kids or like children sacrifice.
Sacrificing children, and also sexual perversion.
Yeah.
Those are the 2 big ones. We're not. We'll touch on that more later. But literally, all the way back here, we knew this sexual sin of some kind happened. And you go, hundreds of years forward in history, and all these people groups come up, and that was the very practice that they adopted. So when you get a word early on, sometimes it seems small and sort of, incidental. But if you follow history long enough, you begin to realize all of these sins that seemingly only affected a small group of people, maybe even just one, sometimes affected nations, ended up in conflict with one another.
I wanted to touch on the son of Ham, Canaan, being cursed and receiving the curse from Noah. And it reminds me of where God talks about like how curses will fall on the 3rd and 4th generation of their children, but the blessings for those who love God will fall on thousands of generations. And so in general, like the desire for the reproduction of children is for your blessing to continue. Mm-hmm. And so the weight of sin doesn't just affect you, it affects your offspring. And so your offspring being affected, in this case, because Ham had done something detestable to his father, his son and the generations to follow carried the weight of that choice. It wasn't just him, but it actually continued through his bloodline. Yeah.
No, you're right. And just in the way that, Adam's, sin, ultimately affected everyone. It's like, this is pretty consistent throughout history. Lot's, like even though Lot was, drunk and his daughters managed to sleep with him, is going to lead to eventually, I think, to the Moabites, the rise of the Moabites. It's like, and but it wasn't his fault. His daughters, well, he was drunk. It's like, well, okay, there are consequences to sin. You know, who would have known that one incident in a cave would lead to a whole other nation that ends up in opposition, you know, to the nation of Israel. So, yeah, a lot of these are pretty far-reaching. The land of Canaan is going to represent the destination of God's people after they've been set free from the degrading bondage of Egypt. I'm going to skip a little bit ahead here. So the land over the Jordan, the promised land, does not speak of heaven. I just wanted to clarify that while we're here. Hebrews 3 and 4 shows Canaan as a picture of rest. You guys just read Hebrews, right? Or at least within the last couple weeks. And it's a picture of rest, but also victory that can be enjoyed by every believer. We all have our battles, you know, and it doesn't mean that we're always in perpetual battle, but it also means that God invites us into His rest. We're gonna see that this land is going to show deliverance from Egypt was only in preparation for the enjoyment of Canaan. You know, like in some ways, our own struggles, you know, once we overcome them or are freed from them, delivered from them, and are walking in abundant life, it's only then that we recognize the depravity that we were previously, engaged with. Our Christian lives were brought out of sin so that we might be brought into abundant life. The wilderness is never God's intended destination for us, just like it wasn't for Israel. So even though the entire generation of Israel is going to die in the wilderness, so many Christians today are going to die in the dryness of spiritual experience, never really walking into the fullness of what God has for them. Are you ready to walk in the fullness of what God has for you?
Wow.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Leviticus. Can someone read Leviticus verse 3 and 30? It's chapter 18, by the way.
So do not do not act like the people in Egypt where you used to live, or like the people of Canaan where I am taking you. You must not imitate their way of life. So obey my instructions and do not defile yourselves by committing any of these detestable practices that were committed by the people who lived in the land before you. I am the Lord God.
Yeah. We could look at these warnings in the same way today in our own world, right?
Yeah.
Do not imitate or conform to the way the world is around you. Do not defile yourselves.
That's so good.
It's like few people today are aware of the coming judgment. Just like the people were probably unaware in Noah's day. And so are these people in the land of Canaan. God's going to warn Israel in Leviticus 18:28. So do not defile the land and give it a reason to vomit you out. That is a pretty stark, that is, as it will vomit out all the people who live there now. The land is going to vomit them out because they are so detestable to the Lord. God's people were expected to do better. So Joshua chapter 1 is going to open with God speaking to Joshua, commanding him to lead the people. Moses is dead. Now it's your turn. It's your turn, Joshua. Verse 3, God's going to extend his promise that he gave to Moses to Joshua, the promise of the victory in the new land, and God's presence to be with him. That's the theme we're going to keep coming back to again and again. The promise of victory in the new land, but also God's presence with them. So Moses was a great leader, and Joshua was his assistant. Probably he'd be a little scared to follow in the footsteps of such a great leader. Joshua was able to see from the inside all the difficulties that Moses had to struggle with and had to endure in leading these people. But now it's on his shoulders. That's the cool thing about God. He meets us right where we are, though. He looks at us as his children, and he knows us like a father would.
Yeah.
We're all unique and different. He's going to encourage Joshua 3 times in just 4 verses to be strong and courageous. That's going to remind him that Joshua, that he will not be alone. He tells him, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. And I tell you, I've had many long, dangerous, scary nights out on trail. And I have to cling to that word, knowing that he's with me, trusting that he'll see me through the night. No matter what animal I run into, no matter what physical obstacle I have to get over or through, he's with me. Okay, 11:15. You ready for that? Is that the... Okay. Let's go to break.
All right, you're good whenever.
Okay. So you mentioned, that, the encouragement, the way that God encourages Joshua. We don't really have time to read that, but I'll just drop these down. Let's see. Yeah, so God's going to encourage Joshua. He's going to encourage him personally. He's going to speak directly to him. He's also going to promise, that he's going to have an active role in all of the work that he's going to do. He's going to remind him that he has actually given it to him. It's actually destined. It's a done work. This language we're kind of familiar with because we hear this in the New Testament. Nobody can stand against you. Not when Yahweh's on your side. It's like playing in a big dodgeball game, and you got all the ringers on your team. And there's just no chance they're going to lose. God also, encourages Joshua by reminding him that he's actually going to he's fulfilling a promise to their ancestors. Yeah, he's going to encourage them to study and meditate and obey the word. And if you do this, then you will prosper. And finally, he's going to remind them to take courage from his presence, that his presence is with him. So, God has this one-on-one time with Joshua, encouraging him to be strong and courageous at the beginning of the chapter and again at the end of chapter 1. Joshua's own men profess that they are with him and tell him to be strong and courageous. And I think this is what Joshua needed to hear to lead. When you know that your folks are behind you, that's pretty encouraging. I know that when I've led schools, I've had both students and staff, you hear the chatter and they like having you, as a leader, it's encouraging, it takes some courage to get out there to lead, but to know that the people support you and they're behind you. So Joshua's going to send out 2 spies from their camp to check out Jericho across the river. As we remember, the last spies that were sent, Moses sent out 12. I wonder why Joshua only sent out 2. He was one of the 2 that was originally sent, and he had a good report. So somehow they're going to come to a house of a prostitute named Rahab. And there's lots of jokes we could make, but I won't. Do you think it was a coincidence that they ended up at the house of Rahab?
No.
Yeah, I don't think so either. I think God directed them there. And Rahab is going to ultimately end up hiding and protecting them. And not just anybody would have done that. Rahab, and it says in chapter 2, verse 9, that she knows that the Lord has given them the land. She says that they've heard of the wonders that God had performed, victories he's given them, and they are all now in fear. That's pretty specific. She confirms that what Moses said to Joshua, Deuteronomy 31:8, that the Lord will personally go before you. God's mighty power and works had gone before them and were causing terror. Saúde. That's Portuguese. So it was in Spanish, I would have said salud. So these people they're getting scared. But how did Rahab know? How did she know that the Lord had given them the land? Obviously, she had heard and seen, but I would maybe suggest that Rahab was given spiritual eyes to see. As we know, she's going to become actually a very important person in the history, of Israel, as well as become grafted into the Messianic line. So it's apparent to her that Israel's God was supreme and could not be stopped. She helped the spies and asked for protection when Jericho would fall. So this is a pagan woman, a prostitute, who is used by God. She would not deny what was obvious to her. And the truth about Israel's God, that he was supreme. And even when her whole city was in denial. This pagan woman is mentioned as one of the heroes. You guys just read Hebrews, right?
Mm-hmm.
So she's mentioned as a hero of faith. Say pagan prostitute. In Levitical law, she was not supposed to be married. This was not someone you're supposed to be, getting married to. Yet she marries an Israelite and ends up in the Messianic line. So that's a pretty significant thing, particularly since we follow a very patriarchal culture in the Old Testament, that a woman's name would be grafted in like that. It plays such a significant role, particularly one that's detestable, to Israel. Do you have a question?
Oh, I guess why did the spies, if they knew she was a prostitute who's unclean, why would they be so receiving of her?
Cavalier. Well, ultimately, I think Yahweh directed them to her, okay. And they recognized that he was going to use her. I don't think it says it in the text, but by her actions, she did help the spies when she asked for protection. I think she had the eyes to see, but ultimately it's kind of like you'll get to this in Isaiah, where Isaiah becomes clean, because of the coal, and this is the reverse of the way we think. We think, if I touch this, I become unclean, unless God touches it,
okay,
and then it reverses.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't want to overstate that in this situation, but it seemed, go for it.
No, I wanted you to finish your thought. Sorry. That's what I was like.
I'm pretty much finished.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Would you go as far to say, God uses Rahab to redeem and regraft in the Canaanites into his promise?
Well,
because they were cursed and now they're brought back in.
Yeah, I guess what I would say, maybe say that one more time, just so we can.
So, I was saying that, do you think God uses Rahab to regraft in the Canaanites and essentially redeem them to have an opportunity to walk into his promises? Because the Canaanites come from Canaan, who was cursed.
Sure.
And was kind of pushed out.
Yeah, I think about, maybe I would use the language that what it shows us is if your heart is willing and open to following Yahweh, you also can be redeemed.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't say there's any kind of a blanket, action towards the people of Canaan, because clearly God is bringing Israel in to exact judgment on the land of Canaan, on the people of Canaan.
Yeah.
But what it shows us is that even though, according to Israel's law, this is a woman that you wouldn't exactly want to be associating with, because she was open to following Yahweh, and in fact becomes a proselyte. She gives her life, to Yahweh, and decides to follow him, helps Israel, not dissimilar. We'll talk about Rahab, or sorry, Ruth, later. Ruth is a Moabite woman, who God is going to graft into the Messianic line, and again, because she's going to forsake everything about her culture and say, your God is my God, and your people be my people, and I will follow you. So I don't know if I want to overstate, on the front end, but certainly these are multiple examples of totally pagan people absolutely receiving the Lord fully and then being used prominently, to usher in the kingdom of God.
Okay.
Yeah. Question, Victor?
I'm just saying, her position as well, she was in the wall of the city.
Mm-hmm.
And so,
she's in, it's kind of I forget exactly what it's called, but you've got basically two walls, in this particular city, Jericho, and there's usually sometimes, connectors that go between, and often there end up being rooms. And one of those, usually it's filled with just rubble to give more mass to the wall to protect it from being knocked over from the outside. But some of these instances, there's actually carved out areas, and it's believed that that's where Rahab was living. But she is mentioned as a hero of the faith. go from a pagan prostitute to a hero of, the faith. That's a pretty big jump. Yeah, it is. It is redemption. And she's also going to end up in the Messianic line, leading, in the genealogy of Jesus, which you could read Matthew 1:5. I think it's amazing that a Canaanite, that she was almost destroyed with the rest of Jericho, was given the honor of being counted in the line of one leading to the birth of Jesus. I've always loved that. 2 spies are going to return with a positive report, confirming the Lord has given Israel the land, and the people are terrified. That's a pretty good report. It's the most fortified city, as far as we know, in this region. God's going to give Joshua instructions for when they cross over to the new land. He's going to tell them that when they get to the Jordan River, it'll be overflowing with water, and that they're to have the priests go before the people with the Ark of the Covenant. This is no light ark. If I've walked through many rivers, and waterways in my time as a hiker, and it can be very difficult when it's that high. It's very easy to lose your balance. It's very easy to get pulled under, to have your pack. You pulled all the way down the river. These guys are carrying something that's quite heavy. So the priests were to take a few steps into the flowing river with the ark, and then to stop. So God's pretty clear with them about that. So the picture there, God will stop the flow of the water, and the river will be dry for them to cross. Who's going to go first? First 2 priests are stepping in, and they got to be thinking like, if this thing falls on me, I'm going to be in trouble. I'm going to drown pretty quickly. It doesn't say that the water will stop and then they step in. It says that they need to step in first, and their water flow will stop and become dry ground. It requires a literal step of faith. Are you ready to take that step in your life? Are you ready to take that step? What's cool here is that God, with his presence connected to the ark, is going to go before Israel into the water. As the people pass by, they see that their God is with them. Emmanuel, God is with us. I love that. I have to cling to it every time I go into the wilderness. So after this miracle, God instructs Joshua to have the people select one person from each tribe to pick up a stone from the riverbed. Not a small stone, but a big one. One that would need to be carried on their shoulder, it says. So what are they going to do with these 12 stones? So like a memorial. Yep. So they're going to build a memorial as a reminder of what God did here for them. It was a reminder that would be passed down from generation to generation. Joshua chapter 4, verses 21 through 24. Then he spoke to the children of Israel, saying, when your children ask their fathers in time to come, saying, what are these stones? Then you shall let your children know, saying, Israel crossed over this Jordan on dry land. And for the Lord your God dried up the waters of the Jordan before you until you had crossed over, as the Lord your God did to the Red Sea, which he dried up before us until we had crossed over, that all the peoples of the earth may know that the hand of the Lord, that it is mighty, that you may fear the Lord your God forever. That all the peoples of the earth may know. Well, Jericho certainly heard about it. This small nomadic people, Jericho heard about them, and the fear was driven into them before they even got there. This memorial was to remind Israel and their children of their identity in God. What I was talking about earlier. Your identity, as a son and a daughter, and your relationship to him. He is your father. This is important to remember when we, especially as we grow older, when we start measuring, or re-identifying ourselves based on our success, our accomplishments, our wealth, our status, etc. Yeah, sadly, too many parents have neglected this responsibility of sharing the works of God in their lives with their children. They no longer take the time, to build their children's identity in Christ. So some think it's even wiser to just let their kids choose. And it's like kind of this weird tension of like not forcing your kids, but at the same time, like you want to pass on the values that you have with them to them. If you just let kids choose for themselves what to believe when they're adults, problem is by that time, their identity has already been firmly rooted in the world. What do we find our identity in today? Inside the church, outside the church. So after crossing the Jordan River, then building a memorial, God commands Joshua to circumcise all the men. Why?
Yeah.
Was that?
Because they weren't all circumcised.
Well, yeah, they weren't all circumcised. Why weren't they circumcised?
They were in the wilderness and they just didn't.
Yeah, and that's a fair answer. Any other ideas? Why weren't they circumcised? We don't 100% know for sure.
It's weird.
It'd feel like a trick question, but really, it's like, well, one, the next generation, the last generation, were they going to the promised land? No, they failed miserably, and so
They were circumcised.
They were circumcised, but yet their kids aren't. What does that tell us? It tells us they didn't continue the practice. Right. Why did they do circumcision in the first place? It was a sign of what? Covenant. Yeah. Exactly. So one, they didn't pass it on to the next generation, out of for whatever reason, out of disobedience, out of neglect, out of rebellion. It's hard to exactly say, but needless to say, they didn't remain faithful to the covenant. And so, what's important that this thing you're going to follow all through the next many books is Israel's covenant faithfulness. Write that one down, because you're going to be looking through that lens for the rest of the story. Israel's covenant faithfulness. Are they being faithful to the covenant? Yeah. So since the last generation, personally, if I was about to go into war to take down a city, I'm not sure that the thing I'd be thinking about is, hey, we need to go get circumcised. I feel like that's not going to be the most pleasant experience, and it's not exactly going to prepare all the guys for battle. But there's there's purification that needs to take place, but there's also some recovenanting that needs to take place too. Spiritually, they need to be prepared, and apparently God thinks that's more important than the physical preparation. They had discontinued the practice. They're going to take the new land. God wants them to identify his people as his people through obedience. Listen and obey. The word Shema, I know you've heard this. They were the same thing. They weren't separate ideas. The name of the place they did this was called Gibeath Haraloth, which means what? It's really pleasant.
Or circumcised.
Hill of foreskins.
Oh, yeah.
Just to make it graphic for you.
Yeah, that's a lot of men in there.
Yeah, that is. So, yeah. Anyhow, verse 5-9, chapter, God says, "Today I have removed the shame of your slavery in Egypt. This generation is getting a new start, a new land, and God wants them to have a new identity in his holy people." You might ask, was it wise to circumcise all the men here when they were about to get attacked? And like I said, I think God thought it was more important for them to be spiritually prepared. And that's important for us as DBS students, to remember, and just as believers, like this is a time of preparation, but it's not just about accumulating knowledge. It's about allowing transformation and application to happen in our life. It's one of the reasons we highlight a personal application once a week and fill it out fully. It's another reason that we lead each other to applications when we do our IBS, because we need to be in the habit of engaging in the Word in this way. And if we just accumulate knowledge, we're not really going to be focusing on application. So God could defend and protect them if he needed to, regardless of what they think the plan is. And as we know, the plan makes as much sense to them as it makes to us. March around the city 13 times and only cheer at the end, and somehow that's, it's like God is not just like with the water and the rock. He gave him the same job, but he asked him to do it 2 different times. 2 different ways, and times. First one, I want you to hit the rock. Next one, I want you to speak to the rock. Why? You hit it. I hit it last time and it worked just fine. God never really seems to do the same thing twice. Just when you think you've got it figured out, your next step of obedience is going to look a little different from the last one he gave you. So, Paul is going to mention the transition of the believer's identity when we become new creations in God, new creations in Christ. 2 Corinthians 5:17. The old has passed away. Behold, all things have become new.
Amen.
Yeah, amen. That's right. Yeah, in our lives, that's what we're looking for. We want to keep growing. They're going gluten-free. I know. So
Our little Gina are just becoming holier.
That's right. Are you gluten-free?
Yeah.
All right. This is where it came from. You're welcome. So now they're going to enter the promised land. It's flowing with milk and honey. That'd be cool to see, but I think we know that's not exactly 100. There's milk, there's honey, but not quite in the river-like mentality. That's how I always pictured it. I was
Not like Charlie and Chocolate.
I just see a river of milk and honey flowing through. How delicious would that be? Someone the other day, we were doing our teachings in the BTS, and someone used an example like, "Hey, what's your favorite thing to put on bread?" And I was like, "Butter and honey." And at that point, all of us were ruined. For the rest of the teaching, because all we could think about was butter and honey. And it's so delicious.
How did the Brazilians react?
There's only one Brazilian in my group, and I think all of our mouths were watering. So, yeah. It says they celebrated the Passover and ate crops from the land, and they never saw manna again. If you have only been eating manna for 40 years, that's a big leap. Mm-hmm. This is actually a testing of your faith in a very new way. Mm-hmm. Like, we just read over that, and you never think about it again. Mm-hmm. So after the crossing the Jordan River, building a memorial, circumcising the men, God has one more test for Joshua. The Bible reads that Joshua sees a man with a sword in front of him. He's going to ask him, are you for us or are you for our enemies? How does the mysterious figure reply?
Neither.
Ooh, there you go. Yeah, you got it. So, no, neither. As the commander of the Lord's army, I have come. This is really important. Like Joshua, we shouldn't question if God is for me or my pursuits. More important question is, am I following God in his direction? Like when he says, as the commander of the Lord's army, I have come. What does that suggest? It actually suggests that Joshua is not the commander of the army. Mm-hmm. He's the leader of the Israelites, but God is the commander. Like God has sent his commander, or representation of. And so we remember they're joining in God with his battle. So when Joshua encounters, I'm going to quote a friend of mine who, you have a Stephen Paz teach? Forgot. No, okay. So when Joshua encounters the commander of God's army before the conquest, for him that's kind of the highlight of the book. Because God will bring about victory no matter how crazy the commands are going to be. So the fact that he sent him the commander, it reminds Joshua what his place really is. And that, again, no matter what they encounter, they need to see God as the leader. This is kind of a microcosm of what the promised land should have been, relying upon God alone. So presumably the supernatural world was Malach, Yahweh, which is angel of Yahweh, is what that means. This is a theophany. You maybe have not heard this word yet before, but theophany means God shining or God appearing. So theophany is God shining or God appearing. This is going to bridge the gap between Yahweh as invisible spirit and Yahweh as the one who reveals himself. And this is something we wrestle with a lot. And it's not as exact as we want it to be and defined as we want it to be. But neither is the Trinity. Neither is God existing forever, eternity past and eternity forward. Time, space, and matter is something that we sort of understand. We don't understand something outside of time, space, and matter. Like the architect of a house is not part of the house. But we know that he exists. And then the house exists. Like time, space, or matter, those three things, none of them could exist without the other. So they all had a beginning. It was all at the same time. But what was before? It's of a nature, of a different kind, something beyond our ability to even understand. We are finite creatures, and our understanding is just finite. It's exactly that. But God is more than that. And so some of these encounters sometimes we have with these mysterious angelic or, like creatures or people that kind of are God or represent God or reflect God, it's not as defined as we would like it to be. But it is important for us to recognize. He says that he was neither on the side that means the hosts of heaven. Basically said that they don't take sides with humans. They are always on God's side. So humans, therefore, must not think that we can get God on our side. But we must take care that we are on the side of God's purposes. That was Joshua 5:13 through 15. That's where you find that. All right. So Yahweh cannot be seen by humans. We hear this in Exodus 19:21. 19 verses 21, and also chapter 33, verse 20. But he takes the initiative to reveal himself in temporary self-disclosures as Malach Yahweh and other forms. Like Moses, also, wasn't able to fully look at God, but he still revealed himself in parts. Moses, his face shining. So God kind of leaves these little breadcrumbs to lead us closer and closer to who he is, to learn more and more about him. But also he reveals more and more of himself as history goes along. All right. Abraham Lincoln once said, anybody want to read that? How about someone read that for us?
Sir, my concern is not whether God is on our side. My greatest concern is to be on God's side, for God is always right.
Yeah, that's the part we got to get. Yeah, thank you. When Joshua heard this figure was God's commander, what does he do?
He falls down.
Yep.
Face down.
Yep, and bows down before him. Joshua knew who the true leader was. And by this it showed his reverence towards God. He's showing that the victory, God was showing Joshua the victory was theirs, but it didn't depend upon Joshua or Israel's might, for the battle belonged to the Lord.
Can you remind me why the question is the wrong question, maybe a friend or?
Because they asked, basically asking, "Are you on our side?" So Israel is asking, "Are you on our side, God? Are you on our side?" And God said, "No. The question is, are you on my side?" Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So we read there's about 40,000 men from just about 2.5 tribes on the east of the Jordan that were strong and ready for battle. So add in the rest of Israel, and there probably would have been over 200,000 fighting men. Again, that's if we accept the numbers as they are, and for our purposes, we will. There's plenty of conversation to be had about that, but I don't think we have a ton of time to go into it. Did God choose to use this army for taking the first city?
Sorry, can you say that one time?
That's okay. Did God choose to use this army for taking the first city? Or does he draw up an alternative plan?
Alternative.
Yeah. So, and one that probably most of us, if we speak Spanish, would call loco, because first thing, it's like, yeah. So this is ancient Jericho. Obviously, it's the best photo I could find. I'm going to give you a little bit of historical background, real quick. The 14th century Amarna letters kind of gave us a rough profile of kind of what the political and social situation looked like in this time. Cities were basically vassals to the Egyptian pharaoh, Akhenaten. So do you understand what a suzerain vassal relationship is?
Yeah.
Suzerain's the big guy and vassal is the small guy.
Yeah.
So each city-state king considered his kingship to be a gift of his Egyptian overlord. So regular payments of tribute were sent to Egypt. If a vassal king behaved or misbehaved and compromised Egyptian interests, he could be executed. Urban aristocracy also existed under the city-state kings. Below them were like tenants, farmers, artisans, slaves. And on the fringes of society were known as the Hapairu, sort of a bandit class who attacked the city-states from time to time. Many scholars, most scholars, I think, believe that probably that was talking about the Hebrews. Not that they were the only ones, but probably that they were the main body that was fighting in this way. A lot of these battles we hear about were these surgical strikes where they would strike hard and destroy everything. But as we learned later, there was people that were left behind. There was also people that ended up joining the Israelites, culturally, like in the time of Joshua, in the time of Judges. There were people, non-Israelites, that left Egypt and came with them. So this is, again, a continual revealing of the Lord's heart for the entire world, not just for Israel. I had to answer a tough question once on the street when I was doing ministry in Israel. This guy with a very Muslim, but very serious looking, he asked me some tough questions, and I remember him saying, yeah, because he had, some issues with the Jews, which I could sense from his questioning. It's like, does God love them better, than Christianity? And that's when I explained to them the Abrahamic covenant. I explained to them, actually, this was God's vision for the whole world and for all people and for all time. The invitation was but God did choose this people to focus on and raise up to be used to that purpose, to that end. And he actually was very receptive. Like, we had a great conversation. That really opened the door. Actually, that conversation was with our friend of mine named Vivian, who's also Brazilian, who Vitor also knows. So anyhow, it pays to learn this stuff. It pays to really understand what God's promises were and to who they were, because there's lots of areas in the Bible that get tripped up on. But we'll have to keep moving. So, all right, they're going to take Jericho. 6 days, 7 priests blowing 7 ram's horns. Ark of the Covenant is with them. Some fighting men in front and behind. The people are going to follow and go one time around. God's going to tell them, don't talk. Why? Why were they told not to talk? It's hard to exactly say, but what it did is the effect. They're marching around. There are probably insults being shouted at them from above, from the walls above. They were told not to respond. When you watch somebody getting yelled at, and someone's just kind of calmly taking it, it forces you to see them in a way that you wouldn't expect. You're like, wow, you have a lot of self-control. You have a lot of confidence. You have a lot of security. I don't know quite what it is, but it also demonstrates humility. So they were told not to respond. It taught them humility, but it also taught Israel, God is your defender. That's part of his character and nature. He is your defender. So you don't have to defend yourselves. On the 7th day, same as above, but now they're going to march 7 times around. There's going to be a loud shout. What's up with the number 7? 7 priests, 7 horns, 7th day, circling 7 times. They march 7 consecutive days.
So on their Sabbath, they march?
Yep. Which tells us what?
You get victory from resting?
Yeah. So, it also shows you that God doesn't really mind the fact that they marched on the 7th day, which reinforces Jesus' teaching about the Sabbath. That Sabbath was made for men, not man for the Sabbath. So we know from Scripture that 7 often represents something complete or perfect. That took 7 days in creation. It was creating a new period here for Israel. But just kind of like in the garden, there was rebellion. And we're going to see that here as well. So They're told to completely destroy the city as an offering to the Lord. God would cause the walls to collapse and the entire city was to be destroyed, all except Rahab's household. So this first city to fall was to be given to God as a first fruits of the land. The city and all of its inhabitants were to be destroyed. Only things made of silver and gold and precious metal were to be saved and added to the treasury of Israel. They were instructed to keep nothing for themselves. God was responsible for victory, and these first fruits were to be devoted to him. But that wasn't exactly how it went down, was it? You guys remember what happened? There's one guy. Achan, you got it. Yeah, so when the spies returned from scouting out Ai, they told Joshua, there's no need for us to go up there. I'm going to bring this down here. And yeah, ultimately, you remember this guy? So he's gonna take some things, and that's gonna kind of get him in trouble. Even though they knew in advance that the courage had melted away from the people, and Rahab said this, they should have had a lot of confidence. Yeah. So basically, they were scouting at Ai. They told Joshua, "There's no need for all of us to go up there. It won't take more than 2,000 or 3,000 men to attack Ai. Since there are so few of them, don't make all of our people struggle to go up there." So 3,000 warriors went, and they were soundly defeated. The men of Ai chased the Israelites from the town gate as far as the quarries, and they killed about 36 who were retreating down to the slope. The Israelites were paralyzed with fear at this turn of events, and their courage melted away. All right, let's see. Oh, yeah, so Ai defeats them. What did I do? No, that's right. Okay. All right. So Israel has sinned and broken my covenant. They've stolen some of the things that I've commanded. Must be set apart. They have not only stolen them, but have lied about it and hidden the things among their belongings. That is why the Israelites are running from their enemies in defeat. For now, Israel itself has been set apart for destruction. I will not remain with you any longer unless you destroy the things among you that were set apart for destruction. Get up, command the people to purify themselves in preparation for tomorrow. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, has says. Hidden among you, O Israel, are things set apart for the Lord. You will never defeat your enemies until you remove these things from among you. Man. That last line, you will never defeat your enemies unless you remove these things from among you. It reminds me of sin that needs to be rooted out in our lives. God has a call for all of us. He has plenty for us to do and be, and yet this is a reminder that God is serious about sin. He's serious about disobedience. So here's a few slides that just show you kind of the breakdown, the whittling down. He started, because Achan doesn't fess up. So you're going to see, the starting with the nation and moving to the tribe, as far as casting lots, down to the clan, down to the family, and finally to the individual. Achan's going to wait until he's found guilty, and then he confesses to bearing the robe and the silver and the gold. His family, his belongings, and his livestock, as far as we know, are destroyed and burned. This was exactly how Jericho was dealt with as well. I see questions.
I feel like I remember reading that God saying whoever stole, then they'll get sent down fire from heaven or something like that. But then I think at the end they take him out to the city gate and stone him. Unless I'm remembering that wrong.
I think they were both stoned and burned. But we could look that. Make a note for me. Maybe a note for me to just go look at that. Just whether they were stoned and burned. I thought it was both. But I'm always. This is what I always say as a teacher. I reserve the right to be wrong.
I don't know. I feel like I remember having that question when I read it, but I also maybe am remembering it wrong.
I think from 7, chapter 7, 24, you can read it. Then Joshua and all the Israelites took Achan, the silver, the robes and gold bars, and his sons' daughters, cattle, donkeys, sheep, tents, everything, brought them to the valley of Azor. And Joshua said, and it goes on and all the Israelites stoned Achan and his family and burned their bodies.
Yeah, so they get dealt with pretty severely, but it mirrors exactly what happened to Israel, or to Jericho. So it also shows us that God deals with us sometimes individually, but other times he deals with us corporately. Like his family was dealt with individually, because probably they were aware of it, because he was hiding in their own tent. But corporately, Israel also, as a whole, was under judgment at this point. This is important for us to remember, this event. We will look back to this again and again and again when we wonder why Israel responds to certain kinds of failures or to certain kinds of activities that make them think that they might fall, out of the good graces of Yahweh. So we will look back to this over and over again. And what's interesting is in chapter 7, verse 11, God says, Israel has sinned because of one guy. Our sin can affect more than just ourselves. It can affect our community. We, you, me. We belong to one body, the body of Christ. What we say and do can have far-reaching effects that may impact not only ourselves, but also our families, our church, our communities. Achan's case, the impact or the consequences of this sin resulted in the loss of their next battle in Ai and the death of 36 Israelites. 36 husbands that didn't come home to their wives and children. Just like Eve in the garden, Achan fell into temptation by desire. He saw, he coveted, he took. What can we learn from their loss in their first battle in Ai? What can we learn about God's promise regarding the land?
As long as they obey him and what his commands, then they'll be victorious. But as soon as they don't, they won't.
Nailed it. So basically the word is conditional. You got it exactly right. It was conditional based on their obedience to Yahweh. It was only after casting lots to determine that Achan was the one who sinned that he admits it. So we've already talked about what happened to him. So just like Achan, or his whole family, was it Achan or his whole family? I'm not sure we're 100% sure. If it was his whole family, probably they were in on it. Probably they knew. Probably they listened. Probably they saw. If they weren't, can we trust God, with that decision? It's harder. It's a harder one to explain to someone. It's a harder one to, but we're going to see God's judgment throughout. You see God's judgment from the beginning. The curse. All of humanity is cursed because of one guy. Sodom and Gomorrah, Tower of Babel, Noah's flood. The flood. It's like we should not be too surprised when sometimes we see judgment that we can't fully explain, even though I feel like it's reasonable that we could explain this. But let's say someone really wants to be a stickler. There's plenty of other periods of time where we have to trust in God's character to judge righteously and to do justly with those that pass from this world. So again, I don't want to overstate that. I just don't want to dodge it and kind of sneak by it without us at least kind of commenting for a second.
Yeah. Real quick.
Yeah.
You said that his promises are conditional upon our obedience, but I guess he's still faithful regardless of our obedience. I guess I'm still trying to have my mind around
You're right on both the things you just said. Yeah, so again, it does not always going to come in the form that we thought it would. Like if God tells you, "Hey, I need you to go pioneer a DBS," and you're like, "I'd rather go do something else," He's going to call somebody else to raise up that DBS. Most likely. And so in this instance, God was going to bring them into the land. He wanted all of them to go into the land to begin with. That whole generation failed. But he still sent another generation, didn't he?
I see what you're saying.
So he's gonna achieve it. The question is, are you going to be the one that says yes and is faithful?
Mm-hmm.
Gotcha.
Or is that inheritance going to go to somebody else?
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I was actually just pondering that the other day. I was like, I wonder if God passed up a certain amount of people until he got to Abraham. I wonder if Abraham was the first guy, or
I go back to actually exactly, was it Terah, Nahor?
Mm-hmm.
there's some language there that if you read it, you might start asking some questions like, was there talk? Because it sounds like they're on their way and then they stop and then, because they leave. Basically, they're leaving, more or less Babylon, so to speak, where they're coming from, which would have been a very prominent and wealthy, area. It would have been one of the most settled and fortified places in the world. All the comforts. And yet he says, here, I want you to go in the middle of nowhere and make me, Yahweh, be, your leader, your God. The fact that Abraham said yes, clearly he believed, but part of me wonders, was there something going on before that? Not saying there is, but I think there's enough instances in Scripture where we see people fail and others get raised up. But I'm not specifically stating over this. But I'm showing you the example from one generation. Literally was supposed to go into the promised land. They all passed away because they were not faithful and they were not obedient. So to me, it would suggest that is how Yahweh operates. Yeah. Okay. Let's see. Let's jump down. Yeah, Israel's going to learn an important lesson through this defeat, with AI. So the summer, I hiked the Colorado Trail a couple of times. I hiked from one end, Denver to Durango, and Durango back to Denver. And there's a lot of snow on the first way. I was basically the first southbounder. I was the first one to cut through and make it through a lot of those, passes. And basically, when I'd go into town, I would write up, hey, this is what I experienced. This is what you need. This is what you should be prepared for when you go. And man, I had people telling me again and again, thank you so much. Because if you hadn't said that, I would have gone weeks before I did. The wrong information can lead to death, out in the mountain country like that. And so I know my experience, I know my skill set, and I also know the way the Lord has been faithful with me. So I had the confidence that I would be fine. But a lot of people were doing it for the first time. And so in many ways, they were looking for that information. But also, when you get the wrong information, that can be life or death. So I say that as an example in hiking, but really that's just a lesson for all of us for our lives. If we operate in the wrong understanding, that can lead not just to our lives being lost, like mine, but also to the people that are going to come behind me. So did you have a question? Okay, just making sure. All right. So the Lord's going to instruct Joshua to attack AI, and he says that he has given them the king, the town, the people, the land. God's going to give Joshua a strategy of setting up an ambush to take the city. Why not march 7 times around the city again, like they did in Jericho?
Because God didn't tell him to.
Yep, you're right. And even on that face alone, that's enough for a reason to believe. God's also not a formula to be used. He's not a formula to be used for our success. He doesn't duplicate his strategies, so we don't we can't think we have God all figured out. So you're right. If we think that we can just, like these guys, if we take a city and we just do this one thing, then we're going to get victory every time. And sometimes in our spiritual walks, we try this. God wants us to continue growing. He wants us to continue being challenged. Every time I teach, I literally spend hours reading through new stuff or memorizing new things or steeping myself in more questions. I'm never going to walk into a teaching and just go, I just keep pulling up the same PowerPoint every time. It's I don't. I got up at 2 this morning. I studied for 5 hours, 5.5 hours this morning. Partly because I'm on jet lag, and partly because that's just my habit when I go into teaching. So I think it's important to get fresh bread every time. It's what I write down or what I put on, I do it differently each time, a little bit. Again, we don't have God figured out. We can't control God. He is going to determine our steps. Our reliance is supposed to be on Him. So the instructions were to completely destroy the city of AI, but this time the Israelites could keep the plunder. Isn't that sad that if Achan had not disobeyed God, just waited a couple days, he would have been alive and also would have been sharing in the plunder. It's another lesson too, and when we take things before we're ready to receive them, when we open up doors that we shouldn't. There's no desire in you that God doesn't want to grant, like righteous desire in you that God doesn't want to grant. He made us creatures that long for pleasure, but he gave us appropriate, and godly ways to exercise that. We open that door before we're supposed to. We might experience something good for a while, but we're also going to experience the negative consequences as well. Rather than just acknowledging, God, you open the door for me, to get married, or whatever the desire is, that we will have the discipline and the patience and the trust that he has something even better for us than what is sitting right in front of us in this moment, in whatever form that is. So anyhow, they successfully take Ai, and the king and the entire population were killed. About 12,000 people died. Was that really necessary? I know your answer would be yes, in order to follow God's commands. And I think that's, honestly, I kind of tease, but I also admire, because I really think that simple faith is really what you need. Like, we live in an age of confusion and misinformation, whatever we want to call it. Simply saying, you know what? I don't understand all this, but I'm going to obey. I'm going to trust and I'm going to obey. Sometimes, it seems a little harsh. 12,000 people had to die. Again, these were evil. A lot of these were very evil people. They were doing terrible things. They were sacrificing children. Even that alone should tell us this is no ordinary group of folks. And if you remember, I know I've got a slide in there somewhere. I think it's probably the next one, actually, so I won't jump to that. But they're going to take Ai. Back in Genesis 15, that's funny, you remember the teaching. 15:16, God had told Abraham that the sins of the people in the land are not yet at the point for their destruction. The Amorites, and I'll show you the text in just a second. We know that God desires repentance, but at some point, judgment must come. It has to. We're going to see that in the prophets over and over again. Like, we're going to be reminded of this. So we don't have to read the whole thing. Genesis 15. For the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet complete. So they waited, many, 400 years, or he predicts 400 years they're going to be oppressed until their evil had grown to such a level that could no longer be ignored and needed to be judged. That's the lens that we have to look at this through. So the rest of the land was already completely wicked. The Amorites were not completely wicked yet. God gave the Amorites 400 years to change. But he knew they wouldn't. It would just get worse. However, God would not judge them until they were actually completely wicked. So, just another reminder. God wanted his people to possess the land, to keep his promise. He wanted his people he will keep his promise. He also wanted to set the stage for later developments in his kingdom plan, to punish those who were an affront. Bless you. To punish those who were an affront because of their extreme sinfulness. And finally, to be a testimony to other people as God's covenant heart reaches out to all the nations. I'm going to give you all these slides later, by the way, just so you'll know. You'll have all of them. But I'm going to jump ahead here. And we're going to take turns. Let's open up Leviticus chapter 18, verses 1 through 30. And how about once you start, read 3 verses and just go this way. We'll go around the room.
Okay.
Chapter 18.
18, 1 through 3. And the Lord said to Moses, give the following instructions to the people of Israel. I am the Lord, your God. So do not act like the people in Egypt where used to live, or like the people of Canaan where I am taking you. You must not imitate the way of life.
You must obey all my regulations and be careful to obey my decrees, for I am the Lord your God. If you obey my decrees and my regulations, you will find life through them. I am the Lord. You must never have sexual relations with a close relative, for I am the Lord.
Do not violate your father by having sexual relations with your mother. She is your mother. You must not have sexual relations with her. Do not have sexual relations with any of your father's wives, for this would violate your father. Do not have sexual relations with your sister or half-sister, whether she is your father's daughter or your mother's daughter, whether she was born into your household or someone else's.
You shall not uncover the nakedness of your sons, daughters.
Verse 10.
Verse 10. I'm in verse 10, but I'm with another
version.
Uncover the nakedness of your son's daughter, of your daughters, for their nakedness is your own nakedness. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's wife's daughter, brought up in your father's family, since she is your sister. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's sisters. She is your father relative.
Do not have sexual relations with your mother's sister, for she is your mother's closest relative. Do not violate your uncle, your father's brother, by having sexual relations with his wife, for she is your aunt. Do not have sexual relations with your daughter-in-law. She is your son's wife. So you must not have sexual relations with her.
Do not have sexual relations with your brother's wife, for this would violate your brother. Do not have sexual relations with both a woman and your daughter, and do not take her granddaughter, whether her son's daughter or her daughter's daughter, and have sexual relations with her. They are close relatives, and this would be a wicked act. While your wife is living, do not marry her sister and have sexual relations with her, for they would be rivals.
Yeah. So I'll stop us here. Do we get the point?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Like the mother, the father's wife, half-sister, granddaughter, stepsister, aunt, daughter-in-law, sister-in-law, relatives together, sisters' wives, during menstruation, neighbor's wife. There's a lot of really evil things going on here that they're being warned not to do, and that's exactly what's prominent in the land of Canaan. This next slide, it's just hard to look at. It's like you're taking children and burning them alive and sacrificing them. And God says, you shall not give any of your children to or offer them to Molech, and so profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. This was no ordinary group of people that were just kind of struggling along and messing up everything. These were people that were truly, evil in their nature. So this brings us to a question, about the moral problem of war. Canaan was not open, available land to Israelites. It was widely populated by various Canaanite groups. So these wars were wars of extermination, commanded by Yahweh. And I can send you lots of sites, to that end. These wars really have caused considerable distress to our modern sensibilities, particularly in light of the message of peace through Christ. So can such wars be correlated with the calling of Israel to be the blessing to the nations, a kingdom of priests among the nations of the world? Two texts I'll give you to look at, when it comes to that question. Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3. So maybe just write those down. Genesis 12, 1 through 3. And then Exodus 19, 5 through 6. That's Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3. and Exodus 19, verses 5 through 6. Again, I think we'll keep going with this, but the ethics of Yahweh war. Why do I keep saying Yahweh all the time?
To define which God you're talking about.
Yeah. I want us to know who we're really talking about. The wars of Israel against the Canaanites, they were not merely wars of conquest. As early as Abraham, Yahweh anticipated that these wars would be wars of judgment. That's in Genesis 15:16. These are wars of judgment. This is not haphazard. The Canaanites' immoral lifestyles were so vile that the land would vomit out its inhabitants. And that would have, if we had kept reading chapter 18, verses 24 through 27, will say exactly that. They would vomit out. So that's verses 24 through 27 in chapter 18 of Leviticus. That's just a good chapter as a whole. Chapter Leviticus 18, read that chapter, know that chapter, understand that chapter, be familiar with it. But such immorality was abhorrent to God himself. And God states that in Leviticus chapter 20, verses 23 to 23. So the wars of Joshua were to be waged on account of the wickedness of the nations. We read that in Deuteronomy. The wars were analogous to the plagues of Egypt, where Yahweh brought judgment upon their gods. And we read that, that cites in Numbers 33, verse 4. Yahweh brought judgment upon their gods. So there was some special things to consider, though. And I will end with this. I know we're right at time, so just give me maybe 2 more minutes, if you don't mind. The limitations of the Israelite invasion. There's limitations. The invasion of Canaan was a one-of-a-kind event. This was not licensed to continue warfare in the future. It can't be used as justification for other war efforts. So however nobly motivated future endeavors might be, they don't get the same pass that this warfare does. The Israelites were not permitted to build an empire. And also the real warrior here is Yahweh himself, not merely Israelite soldiers. So some targets, Jericho specifically, the Israelites were forbidden from taking booty or spoil, which in turn is going to prevent them from treating the invasion as simply a means for personal gain. So they've found stores of food hidden inside some of the, when they've excavated stuff, they've taken they've found this stuff in there. It's it was still there. People are not going to leave that behind, but they did out of obedience. So war also was not the final goal, but rather a vision of peace. Ultimately, it was the final goal. So the question really is not whether Israel had the right to dispossess the Canaanites of their land. The question is rather whether Yahweh had the divine right to judge the people in the land of Canaan. So, the invasion of Canaan by the Israelites no more took away God's promise to the nations, through Abraham's seed, than the later exile would be taken away from God's promises to Israel as a channel through which the Messiah would come. So why would you say to a modern person who argues that the story of Joshua is simply an ancient account of genocide? Why would you say to a modern person, what? I said why. What would you say to a modern day person that argues this is just an act of genocide?
It was just.
Yeah, you're right. It was just. Now, again, what I might do is I might leave this. Let's leave that. I'll leave that question with you guys. We can think about it tonight. Because it's easy for me to say it to you because you believe and trust me and trust the word. How do you say that to somebody who doesn't necessarily? Just something to think about. And also maybe, we don't have to visit that one. But the last thing I'll say is that the common interpretation of a sweeping conquest with nearly immediate occupation of the land, it's not what the book of Joshua is describing. So it's actually, and to expect archaeology to kind of to demonstrate that conclusion is kind of flawed. So what I mean is that there was many different battles and they had many successes, but that didn't mean they occupied the land right away. It meant that there was still lots of Canaanites living in these areas who they were expected to defeat and drive out, once we entered into the period of the Judges. So it's just something to keep in mind. This was not immediate occupation. They were going from one camp, doing their military strikes, returning. At least the battles we're about to enter into. That's what's going to happen. They're going to go to Gilgal, get ready, go out and fight, and then they'll come back, do another battle. So this took several years for all of this to be accomplished. So anyhow, we're out of time. Sorry, only a couple minutes over. There it is.
Thanks for listening to the YWAM Nashville podcast. If you want to get more information about our community, you can follow us on Instagram, Facebook, Spotify, YouTube, and TikTok at YWAM Nashville. To get connected, visit our website at ywamnashville.org or contact us at info@ywamnashville.org.